To completely understand the definition and full impact of capitalism, we have to go back in time. The feudal economy. From the 12th century to the 5th centuries, medieval feudal society was based on a series of regional based, largely self supporting economic systems, each composed of a town and surrounding agricultural district. Within these mini economics, were forced to work the land for a feudal lord in exchange for the right to build shelter on and work a small strip of land. Although they were allowed to cultivate this strip of land, and if they could afford to keep animals on it, they still had to hand over part of their produce as rent. After paying this rent and meeting their own needs, they traded the little that was left of their harvest in the town, produced by the town's craftsmen. The gentry and the innumerable servants consumed the harvest from the Lord's land, plus the peasant rent. Any surplus was traded for locally produced goods or for imposed goods, although the latter were limited luxuries. In the towns, industries were organized into powerful guilds, and production was carried out by master craftsmen and their families. Only men could enter the guilds to become skilled workers, and this direct structural sexism was a severe limitation on the economic and social power of women. Each craftsman owned his tools and worked in a single shop with his family and assistant. Guilds aimed to eliminate competition, both from within and from outside the regional economy, and to limit production to ensure it didn't outstrip demand, causing prices to fall, which they would if market forces came into play. Only guild members could produce and sell goods in the region. They could not expand their output beyond a given point, nor could they hire more than the agreed number of assistants. Gale set exact quality standards to which goods had to produce as well as the prices they must be sold at. Thus, they maintained monopoly production, ensuring a decent standard of living for craftsmen in their families. The feudal economy persisted in this form up to around the end of the 15th century. Thus, social and economic life continued to be characterized by dominance of agriculture and by production geared to meet immediate local needs, including those of the feudal landlords. There were numerous restrictions to ensure that the regional economies remained relatively closed. For example, the sale of goods from outside the economic region was severely restricted. Through such restrictions, the feudal lord ensured the continuation of the economic region on which his authority and economic survival depended. Trade was limited, and so the amount of money in circulation was very small. Rise of the merchant class. The relative static feudal way of life, which had endured for centuries, began to break down at the beginning of the 16th century. A primarily cause of the shift away from feudalism was increased foreign trade, which led to the emergence of a new class of merchant capitalists. This new merchant great fortune by purchasing foreign goods cheaply and selling them on at a huge profit to Europe aristocracy. This boom led to many European countries growing rich from taxes and attempting to boost their share of trade by establishing colonial empires. Once a country established a colony, it would try to impose a trading monopoly by banning foreign merchants and ships. For example, the riches of Spanish colonies in the Americas could only be exported to Spain, where they were traded on to other European countries at a tremendous markup, enriching both Spain merchants and the Spanish state. The race for new colonies inevitably led to conflict. England, being a relative latecomer to international trade race, found that many of the prime sources of wealth had already been snapped up. So it embarked on nearly 3 centuries of war to establish its own colonial empire. Thus, it defeated Spain in the 16th century, Holland in the 17th century, and France in the late 18th century, and in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, having meanwhile spread its supremacy throughout Britain. England thus became the world's mightiest seafaring and colonial power. Indeed, it was to engage in bloody wars right up to the Second World War in an attempt to maintain economic power. Ironically, after centuries of war, Britain finally lost her supremacy, economic status, to a former colony and a close friend, the USA. The growth in trade, both outside and within Europe, led to increased money exchange. This in turn led to inflation being injected in the feudal economies for the first time, so that the 16th century witnessed a price revolution. For instance, in Britain, wheat prices, which had been static for centuries, more than trebled between 15,000 and 15,074. Increased use of money and inflation began to undermine the feudal order. The gentry wanted money to buy the new luxury goods that flooded Europe. Meanwhile, spiraling prices meant they could make more money either by producing and trading agricultural goods directly, or renting the land to a growing class of large-scale farmers. Thus, capitalism was quick to penetrate into English agriculture, where part of the land owning class formed a block with the new capitalist farmer. These changes in economy led to a dramatic change in social relations. The peasantry, who had been, to all intents and purposes, tied to the land and virtually owned by the lords, were set free. In other words, evictions gathered pace as trade increased, especially as the growth of textile industry raised the demand for high quality English wool. The landed gentry enclosed more and more common land to raise sheep. Such land was owned collectively by the peasantry and was forcibly taken over, stolen by the aristocracy. Some measure of the pace of evictions can be coached from contemporary writers. Thomas More, at the start of the 16th century, recorded that the sheep swallowed down the very men themselves. 15,081, Stamford wrote, "Gentlemen do not consider it a crime to drive poor people of their property. On the contrary, they insist that the land belongs to them. Throw the poor out of their shelter like curs." In England, at the moment, thousands of people, previously decent householders, now go begging, staggering from door to door. Evicted from the land and faced with massive price rises for basic foods, the lives of an increasing number of landless peasants became one of desperation and growing starvation. Evictions were carried on in Britain for the first 3 centuries. As a result, today it still has the smallest rural population in the industrialized world. And even among these, the majority neither own nor work or the land. It is interesting to note that the transition from feudalism to capitalism took a different route in France due to the French Revolution. The land which under feudalism was jointly owned by the lord and the peasant, was taken from the defeated autocracy and handed to the peasantry, making France a country of a small scale peasant, holding the opposite of what occurred in Britain. It was not just in the countryside that the feudal order was breaking down. In the towns throughout the 16th century, the guild system also suffered due to the increased trade. The new merchant capitalists now brought goods locally for export. Hence, these were no longer produced for sale locally, but were instead sold to merchants. As merchants could travel the country to buy the cheapest goods, craftsmen soon found themselves competing with each other in a national market. This undermined the guild system, which could only operate through control of regional economies, maintaining monopoly production, and keeping market forces at bay. However, with the establishment of a national market, the regional monopolies were broken. Henceforth, market forces began to dictate patterns of trade, fundamentally affecting all aspects of production, consumption, and pricing of goods. The emergence of capitalism. Capitalism started to emerge during the 17th century. At the first, merchant or buyer offers, as they became known, were a link between the consumer and producer. However, gradually they began to dominate the latter, first by placing orders and paying in advance, then by supplying the raw materials and paying a wage for the work done in producing finished goods. The concept of a waged worker signaled a crucial stage in the development of capitalism. Its introduction was the first stage in the buyer upper's transition from merchant, making money from trade, to capitalist, deriving wealth from the ownership and control of the means of production. The first stage of capitalism had come into being. The stage saw one new class, the primitive capitalist, exerting power over another new class, wage workers. Early capitalism also engendered new methods of production. The earliest was the cottage industry, which saw individual homes become mini factories with production directed by the capitalist. The cottage industry model became so widespread in the wool and textile industry that it became a method of mass production. In turn, the wool trade became Britain's most important industry by the end of the 17th century. Importantly, the hundred-year transition from feudalism to primitive capitalism had a strong state support. The regional-based feudal economies and the power of the aristocracy ran counter to the interest of this alliance between capitalism and the increasingly centralized state. The state gained the wealth it desperately needed to maintain its growing bureaucracy and standing army by tapping into capitalism through taxes, customs, duties, and state loans. In return, it conquered colonies, fought for dominance of the world markets, and took measures against foreign competition and the restrictions of the export of raw material, destined for competitors and taxes concessions on the importance of raw materials. Restriction on exporting raw materials hit the aristocracy particularly hard as agriculture produce. By its nature, raw material bureaucrats and capitalists defeated the aristocracy through a section did survive the transition from feudalism by forming an alliance with the new capitalists. It is worth noting here the alliance between the state and capitalism occurred across Europe. through in different forms. In Germany, where capitalism was much less developed and therefore weaker, the more powerful state was able to exercise much more control. This was an early indication of the development of the social market in Germany, under which the state has much more power. In Britain, capitalism was much more developed and so was able to exist much more influence, leading to the development of the free market system, under which the state has far less influence. Social impact of capitalism. The establishment of capitalism was a time of upheaval and bitter struggles between new and old power breakers. At the same time, the mass of the population were dragged, unwilling, into an increasingly violent conditioning process. The new capitalists needed to be able to exert ever more pressure on their producers to produce more for less, so that the capitalists could maintain trading prices and increase profits. They looked to the state to ensure pressure was brought to bear on workers who, for the first time, were being forced to sell their labor in an increasing competitive work environment, which was itself aggravated by the swollen ranks of the new landless and unemployed. Laws were passed setting a rate for the maximum wage payable to peasants. The aim of all this brutal legislation was to turn the disposed into a disciplined, obedient class of wage workers who, for a pittance, would offer up their labor to a new capitalism. The state also clamped down on beggars whose ranks were swollen by disposed peasant ruined. Craftsmen, able-bodied vagabonds were lashed or branded with red-hot irons, while persistent vagrants were liable to execution. The problem of creating disciplined and regimented workforce should not be underestimated. Viewed from our advanced modern industrial perspective, submitting to the routine of going to work daily for a set number of hours, usually inside a building, appeals the norm. From the perspective of the 16th and 17th centuries peasant, however, this routine would have been alien. The working day under a pre-capitalist agrarian system would have been shaped by hours of light and hours of darkness, as most work took place out of doors. The intensity and length of labor was dedicated by seasonal considerations, such as planting or harvest periods. Similar holiday periods, even those marked by the church, were seasonally derived and often based on ancient pagan festivals. The number and extent of these holidays helped define and shape the working year up until the Reformation during the 16th century. It is estimated that around 165 days a year, excluding Sundays, were given over to celebrations and festivals. The rise of manufacturing. The spread of capitalism meant by the feudal economic system and the power of the aristocracy was internal decline by the late 17th century. The establishment of mass production based on the cottage industry meant England was well on the way to becoming a capitalist and industrialized based society as the 18th century progressed. This transition was completed during the 18th century. A primitive form of manufacturing developed, which differed from cottage production in that workers did not work from home, but rather from single premises or factory owned by the capital. However, this early manufacturing differed from its later form in that still dependent on human physical power with little use of machinery. As such, early 18th century manufacturing can be seen as a link between domestic production based on courage industry and capitalist production based on the mechanized factory system. At first, the move towards factory production was driven by cost. Centralized production spared capitalists the cost of distributing raw materials to individual workers. Further, as the factory system developed, it soon became clear that it gave capitalism much greater control over the workforce, establishing tighter organization of work and workers, and thus higher productivity. Keeping production under one roof also meant the possibility of speeding it up, breaking the process down into plain stages. This entailed workers specializing in one particular component of the production process. Within this new system, the worker's role was reduced to repeating the same monotonous task over and over. This led to gains by the capitalists because of the greater speed of the production process and the better quality of goods. Importantly, this division of labor into separate tasks significantly transformed the nature of work. It effectively skilled craftsmen and women who had been trained to produce finished goods. By participating in the process of production from beginning to end and arguably removing the sense of meaningfulness inherent in being present in the whole process of production to the point of completion. These transformations of the place and nature of work led to yet another fundamental change in social relations. Society rapidly evolved into clearly defined social classes. The industrial capitalist and the wage worker capitalists broke their remaining links with their merchant past, giving up their commercial role to concentrate on organizing the production process. Their sole source of income was profit gained from the exploitation of the labor of the emerging working class. Working class also changed dramatically under the factory system. Even under the cottage industry system, workers had had so many independence, owning their own basic tools and cultivating a plot of land enabled them to subsidy their income. This and the fact that they worked unsupervised from home gave them some degree of autonomy and control in the factory. Any semblance of autonomy was lost completely. Workers had to work a specific number of hours outdoor the direct supervision of the capitalist, who owned the more specialized tools. With no land or no tools to earn extra income, workers became totally dependent on their ability to sell labor. Thus, a clearly defined working class was emerging, separated totally from even limited control of the means of production. The wage slave had been born. New social relations within the factory also developed. With the division of labor, it was necessary for someone to coordinate the actions of many workers. The job of overseer or foreman came into being separate from the rest of the process, a concept which had never before existed. Though the creation of primitive factory system did greatly increase productivity, the savings made were not enough to entirely eliminate cottage industries, which still had many advantages. Under the cottage system, the capitalists did not have to pay for a factory and its upkeep. Wages could be kept to a minimum, as cottage laborers paid for much of their own upkeep through growing their own food and working on their own behalf. As a result, production was often integrated with the first and last part of the process based in the factory. And the international parts done by cottage laborers. Through such developments, manufacturing grew out of the cottage industry in Britain. This contrasted with the rest of Europe, where the state generally remained stronger and attempted to introduce manufacturing by planning, providing factories, and recruiting the workers, for example. In France, capitalism was far more state directed, and this remains the case today. The needs of capitalism changed as factory production developed, and the state was again enlisted to ensure continued expansion under existing apprenticeship laws. The right to engage independently in industry was only granted to men who had served a 7-year apprenticeship and who were members of guild. This severely limited the number of workers that could be hired, which hampered the spread of factory production. At first, manufacturers bypassed guild regulations by setting up in rural areas and new towns where the guild system didn't operate, and by investing new industries not covered by guilds. However, capitalism expanded, calls for unregulated free labor market growth. The state responded by sweeping away the remaining restrictive guild regulations, bringing the power to an end. It also underdetermined the practice of local justice of peace, setting minimum wages levels. The free market form of British capitalism demanded and got a completely deregulated, unprotected workforce that it could then exploit the fall. Capitalism developed quicker in Britain and was far more productive than elsewhere. It produced more goods more cheaply. This brought calls from Britain capitalists for international free trade and for an end to protectionism. So, after centuries of building up the economy behind barriers for foreign competition, Britain suddenly decided that protectionism is an abomination. This tactic has been used since the all advanced capitalist countries, including the US, Germany, and Japan, current attempts by the developed nations to force underdeveloped nations to open their borders to free trade under so called free trade agreements should be viewed in the light. The laws originally brought in by the state to protect the interests of capitalism against foreign competition were now a barrier preventing the more dynamic sectors of British industry, more notably the cotton and metal traded, more exploiting overseas markets by the late 18th century. Calls for free trade had gained widespread currency, particularly with the publication in 1776 of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. This laissez-faire free market ideas upon which British capitalism developed still dominate the British ruling elite thinking and help explain that the Thatcherite free market revolution occurred in Britain in the 1980s rather than elsewhere. The Industrial Revolution. By the early 1770s, the economic and social conditions were in place for the Industrial Revolution to exploit onto the world's economies. Powered by a number of new inventions, the primitive factory system was transformed as machine power drove productivity to unprecedented levels. With factories transformed by new machinery, the cottage industry could not possibly complete and soon collapsed. Between the 1770s and the 1830s, there was a boom in factory production, with all manner of buildings being converted into factories and the majority of wage labor taking place within factory buildings. It would be oversimplistic, however, to see the Industrial Revolution merely as a result of the invention of machineries that replaced many workers. As we have seen, the social relation needed for the Industrial Revolution to take place had taken centuries to evolve. Without the factory system, these inventions would have been meaningless in the first place. The machinery introduced into workplaces of late 18th and early 19th century. England was specifically intended for factories, as they had developed within the economic and social conditions of the time. In this sense, we can see that inventions themselves were largely products of a particular context within history. In addition, it should be noted that interventions of machines to aid production was hardly new under feudalism. Their production had been opposed by the guilds, often violently, with the audacious interventor occasionally being to put death. For example, the Ripon loom was banned in the 16th century after guild opposition, but the demise of the guilds meant the way was open for introduction of all manner of labor-saving inventions. The water wheel, the blast furnace, pumping machines for miners, improved transmission of power through co-wheels and by wheels were just a few of innovations which paved the way for the industrial revolutions. Given the preconditions to the development of capitalist industry, it is hardly surprising that the industrial revolution first took off in the cotton industry. Cotton production was only appealed in Britain in the late 17th century and was free of any guild restrictions. Further, it had to compete with the well-established woolen industry. Both these factors encouraged highly productivity, resulting in the invention of the spinning jenny in the 1730s, followed by the mechanical loom. However, it was not until the invention of the steam engine that the Industrial Revolution truly took off. Steam power replaced human power, first in the cotton and metal industries, then brought out the rest of industry. This explosion in productive power transformed Britain's economy as productivity increased. So the prices of manufactured goods plummeted, stimulating demand for British goods across the world. As a result, the value of British exports rose from 15 million in 1760 to 55 million in 1805. This new wealth, however, was not experienced by the workers whose labor had made it possible abroad. These were the black slaves upon whose backs the cotton industry in Lancashire grew and prospered. In Britain, it was concentrated among the few capitalists who owned the means of production and bought, with capitalists detected wages, the labor of the workers. It is important to note that ownership of the means of production at this stage in the development of industrialized capitalism meant not only the ownership of factories, machinery, and the power to invest of withhold capital, but also the means of the production of knowledge. Capitalists who own newspapers, for example, could exert great political influence to protect their own interests. Ownership of a newspaper meant not only the direct control of print workers, distributors, and sellers, but control over the transmission of information. This could, for instance, extend to direct or indirect political influence through a specific politicians or parties. It might also extend and protect capitalist interests by the spread of ideology and less subtly blatant propaganda. Within the conditions engendered by the Industrial Revolution, workers faced up to 18 hours a day in the factories and horrific living conditions in the booming manufacturing towns. The brutality of the new capitalist system is perhaps best summed up by its treatment of children. Women workers from the onset of the Industrial Revolution were used as cheap labor while retaining child raising responsibilities with nowhere to leave children. Women had a little choice but to bring them to work. It was not long before they were seen by capitalism as an even cheaper source of labor. By the early 18s, children as young as 5 could be found in working up to 20 hours a day. Mines with conditions little better above ground in the factories. Orphanages systemized this slavery, handing over a steady stream of children to factory owners. Along with the terrible living and working conditions, wages fell in real terms due to rockily corn prices caused by the Napoleonic Wars. In response to the rise in corn prices, and with an eye on the main chains, large farmers and the aristocracy rushed to grow wheat on every available patch on the land. This caused the enclosure of yet more common land, implying the countryside over greater numbers of peasant farmers, and driving them into misery of the industrial cities. This conclusive chapter in rural clearance completed the country's whole process of transforming Britain from a feudal agricultural society into the world's first capitalist industrial society. Demographic statistics of the period are extremely illuminating. In 1750s, some 90% of the population of England lived in the countryside. By the time of the 1851 census, the number of people living in urban settlements was greater than those living in rural. Conclusions. A brief look at the history of the economic and social conditions that preceded the Industrial Revolution shows that capitalism did not arise from the efforts of a few inventors causing an industrial revolution, nor because British capitalists had some special enterprising spirit. It arose from the systematic breakdown of feudalism and a social and economic system and the imposition of a wage labor system in its place. Sadly, capitalists and state bureaucrats copied the success of industrialization across the Western world as they sought to cash in on this huge wealth enjoyed by the new British ruling class. The capitalist system, based on the exploitation of the working class, soon spread to Europeans, as we will see, to the rest of the world. Presently, capitalism, alongside its essential partner institution of sexism, racism, and homophobia, dominates the global economy, continuing to inform and maintain the social relations within it. The new familiar pattern of economic success being measured by which country of capitalists can extract the most profit from the workers under their control has its origin in the transition of British from a feudal society. The coming of capitalism has somewhat paradoxically also brought with it the potential for workers to organize for change. Through capitalism brought with it untold misery, ordinary people were far from passive victims in the face of exploitation. Instead, they sought to resist capitalism, giving birth to the idea of an alternative world free from exploitation and misery. Key points: present day capitalism arose from the systematic breakdown one of social and economic system based on obligation and the rise of another social and economic system based on wage labor. Until the end of the 18th century, the work experience of the laboring population in England was predominantly agrarian based, but by the mid 19th century was predominantly urban. Colonialism, involving the establishment of national trading monopolies, began with merchants and states chasing the wealth created by foreign trade and led to several wars over exploited foreign territory. Over 4 centuries, changes in the economy in England led to changes in social relations. The Industrial Revolution began in England and came about as a result of changes in economic and social relations. The present day model of the capitalist exploitation of labor for profit has its origins in the transition of Britain from feudalism to capitalism.